David Hume. Hume was, in some ways, an extraordinary philosopher in that he kind of went against the views of his time more than most of the other philosophers we've looked at. In some ways, his views are quite radical, but on the other hand, he's not really recommending that people make big changes in their lives unless they're very religious. He probably would recommend that they make some changes in their lives. But for the most part, his main message is that philosophy cannot achieve very much. So he, in some ways, he's mainly addressed to philosophers and people who think that philosophy can give us all the answers. He was born in 1711 up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he was something like 11 years old when he went to the University of Edinburgh. That's kind of young. So he was a child prodigy, and he studied the sorts of things you study in 18th century Scottish universities. And he was always interested in philosophy and especially skepticism. His work is very skeptical. It's especially skeptical about philosophy. He started writing his book, A Treatise on Human Nature, and then it got published. I think the first part was published when he was about 28 years old, which is pretty young to be publishing a major work in philosophy. Nobody liked it. Then about 10 years later, he wrote an inquiry concerning human understanding, an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, which basically had the same ideas in them, but they were shorter, and he left out some of the ideas that he sort of either didn't like or didn't think it was a good idea to talk about much from his earlier work, The Treatise. He was a bit more successful with those two philosophical works. He was interested in philosophy throughout the rest of his life, although those were his sort of major philosophical works. He also wrote dialogues concerning natural religion, which is a dialogue between two people, and kind of basically one of them is pro-religion and one of them is anti-religion. He doesn't say on which side he is in that dialogue, so it's kind of cagey. But he made special care to make sure that that work, the dialogues, didn't get published until after his death. His experience had been that the religious authorities made his life more difficult. He applied for positions in universities, and it seemed like the fact that his views were anti-religious meant that it was impossible for him to get a job. So eventually he got a job as a librarian in the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh. And it seems that to a large extent, he spent his time there, not really doing his work, but rather writing his multi-volume History of England. That was a big publishing success. And basically, he made most of his money from that bestseller. He was involved in talking to other intellectuals. He was a big influence on Adam Smith, who went on to write The Wealth of Nations. And in some ways, Hume was a big supporter of free trade and against things like tariffs. He died in 1776, around the age of 65, and he died saying that he certainly didn't believe in any kind of afterlife. So his basic philosophical, or we might even call them anti-philosophical claims, that you can't justify metaphysical beliefs. You can't really go beyond your experience. So he certainly doesn't think that religious belief is justified, but he also says that the belief we have in a world that's there beyond our senses is also not capable of justification. So that's part of how radically skeptical he was. He also thought that it was a total mistake to think that reason can give us morality, as most other philosophers had thought. He thought, no, the only thing we get from morality from is our basic feelings. It's nothing to do with reason, it's to do with just how we feel about the world. So we're going to look at these areas. So we're going to start out with his theory of ideas, which is basically his psychology. And we'll look at these other areas, not necessarily in this order. There's our knowledge of the external world, causation, the self, free will, then induction, proving God's existence, and morality. It's helpful to think about, who was Hume arguing against. In some sense, he was arguing against everyone. He was arguing for views which hardly anybody else would agree with. But he was especially thinking of people like Descartes and then other contemporary rationalist philosophers. So René Descartes, as you've already seen, believed in innate ideas. He thought God gave us innate ideas, especially of God. And we've seen how Locke criticized that. And to a large extent, Hume agrees with Locke's criticism. He thinks that we get those ideas not from God, but just from sort of regular ways of learning about ideas. And he certainly doesn't think that we can have a priori sort of mathematical knowledge of the world. He thinks that the way we understand the world is through empirical evidence. He's definitely opposed to dualism, but also he's also opposed to materialism. His main sort of stance is we shouldn't be taking these big positions about the nature of thought. Rather, we should just stick with our experience and avoid making any big decisions about the true nature of thought, because all we have is our experience. He was also thinking about Malebranche, probably more than Descartes. We're not covering Malebranche at all in this course, but maybe Malebranche was sort of maybe one of the main people on his mind. And Malebranche had reasonably extravagant metaphysical views. He thought that God is really the only true cause of all events and effects. So whenever you see something happening in the world which looks like causation, hitting one pool ball, and then it hits another, and the other one moves off, that seems like that's causation. Malebranche would say, actually, what's happening is God is moving everything. So on Malebranche's view, God is extremely busy moving everything in the world. Hume definitely thought that was ridiculous. How could you possibly know that? He was also thinking about Leibniz, and Leibniz also didn't really think there was causation in the world as we see it. Rather, he thought that everything is being arranged basically by God to happen right from the beginning of time. So God isn't doing it right now. It was like God set out the whole history of the universe right from the beginning of time. And so everything is already pre-established. obviously that's not an idea that Hume is going to buy into. It seems, you know, an incredible assumption. Kind of hard to imagine how anybody could take that seriously. But Leibniz did take that view seriously. Hume thought that was just pure speculation. Hume kind of was thinking about, especially about those kinds of people. Maybe in the back of his mind, he had people like Plato, and Aristotle, Aquinas. They were kind of probably in the back of his mind. But he was also thinking about these other philosophers who were basically contemporary with him and were writing. And so he was more in dialogue with them. So we'll start off with his theory of ideas, which isn't very different from the theory of ideas of Locke. Locke had this idea of the mind is a theater of ideas. Really, what the mind consists in is just conscious ideas passing through your mind. Then Locke gave kind of some classifications and explanations of the pattern of ideas we get in our minds. Hume uses slightly different terminology. He focuses on different things, but it's not very different from Locke's. So he thinks maybe the most important distinction for what's in our heads, there's impressions and ideas. Impressions are like the vivid sensations. Obviously, you get that in vision and sound, smell. But it's not just external, it's also internal. Passions like love and hate and other emotions, they're all kind of impressions. They're all vivid, they're all strong. Then there's ideas, which are faint copies of impressions. And they are either through memory, or if you're kind of combining different impressions, then it would be imagination. But he thinks they're inevitably less vivid than the original impressions. It seems to be, it makes a lot of sense. Certainly my memories tend to be far less vivid than my original experiences. Although you wonder what he would say about a nightmare. Nightmares can be very vivid. So would you want to say that are they impressions or ideas? It becomes a little unclear exactly how to classify everything. But the basic idea is pretty straightforward. Here's a quotation from Hume. All our ideas, or more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. So he has the rough start of a theory of how to explain the flow of ideas in our heads. And he says, well, ideas get connected by principles like resemblance. So if one idea resembles another, and then you hear one, if you see one kind of cat, then you might be reminded of another kind of cat. Or there's contiguity, either spatial or temporal. If you tend to see two things together and then you see one, then you'll be thinking of the other. And then there's kind of cause and effect. If you see the cause of something, you'll be thinking about the effect. It doesn't seem like a very sophisticated way to explain our thoughts, but it seems kind of there's some sort of truth to it. And that kind of approach was the main approach that was used back in the 18th century. And like Locke, he had a kind of atomistic conception of how we build ideas. You start with simple ones, and then you can build into more complex ones. I think I call that with Locke a sort of a Lego theory of ideas. Like Locke, he criticizes the possibility of innate ideas. He goes actually against Locke when it comes to abstract ideas like the concept of redness, or the concept of God, or the concept of the number 8. Hume says abstract ideas don't really exist. We can't really have an abstract idea because any idea has to be a particular one you can actually have in your head. And an abstract idea is just a generality. And so he doesn't think it's possible to have an abstract idea like that in your head. So then he has to sort of explain why do they seem abstract or general? I'm not sure his explanation is particularly convincing, but he's very wedded to the idea that all our ideas are particular ideas, that they're not just general ideas. So let's look at his skepticism about knowledge of the external world. In some ways, it's a pretty simple view. The idea is that the only way we learn about the world is through our experience, and there's no way to kind of learn about the world beyond our experience. Like you can't. Basically, we're trapped within a veil of experience, and you can never get beyond it. So there's never any reason to believe there's something beyond our experience. At the end, we'll talk a little bit about whether that makes sense as an argument. Doesn't necessarily seem the greatest argument, but that's what he said. So he's definitely criticizing Locke's view of indirect perception. Now, Locke thought that primary qualities are there in matter, and then we can have ideas of primary qualities. And so our ideas resemble the world. Hume was saying, like, well, how do you know your ideas resemble the world? The only way you can think of the world is through your ideas. So you've no idea what the world is like outside of your ideas. So it makes no sense to say there's any kind of resemblance. So he's basically rejecting the idea of primary qualities, although I mean, I think you can read him as still making some sort of distinction between like the scientific qualities of things and then the appearances of the secondary qualities, but he's not really agreeing with the whole possibility that we can really know the real nature of matter. So he doesn't really believe in primary qualities at all. He says that assuming that the world exists beyond your impression is inference to the unseen, which is kind of sort of slightly puzzling phrase. And like, now I see the table. I think, well, I am seeing the table. And he says, no, like that, all you're really seeing is your experience. That's all you've got. And your experience is different from the table. You can never directly connect with the table. So that's why he uses this idea of inference to the unseen. So he thinks we can basically construct an external reality based on our patterns of impressions, but we never really see it and we don't actually know anything about it. So it's just an unjustifiable leap to believe in this external reality. So here's a quotation from the treatise. He says, it's a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here, experience is and must be entirely silent. Now, if somebody goes around saying, well, you don't know this table exists, you're going to think, well, that guy's pretty strange. So how does he feel about that? When he says, everybody has this kind of natural tendency to talk as if we know about the external world. He thinks that's just instinctual. That's a kind of how we're programmed. It's a natural sort of belief. He says, he calls it a vulgar belief. I mean, calling it vulgar suggests that he doesn't really admire it, but he says, well, that's how it is. His basic point is, so if you're kind of making philosophical claims, then it's important to be careful about what you can prove. But if you're just living your life, if you're kind of going about doing your job, kind of trying to have your everyday life, you don't need to worry about that sort of difference. You can just go along with your everyday habits. And he really thinks going along with your everyday habits is a good way to go. So he thinks that these beliefs are just based on a sort of psychological association. And he thinks it's sort of basically a kind of practical necessity to keep on talking as if we know about the external world. And he doesn't really think it's a problem so long as you don't take it too literally. So that leads us to his view of causation. Here, I think Hume is reacting especially to people like Leibniz and Malebranche, and maybe even his relationship to Newton is a bit more complicated. He makes some general points, which sometimes get a little bit hard to understand unless you kind of think about people like Descartes. Right. So what he's saying is, like, when you see things interact in the world and you think, oh, there's cause and effect, pool balls hitting each other, or you turn a light switch on and the light goes on. Those seem like regular cases of causation. And in some ways, you think he's fine to talk about causation and to spell out what we mean by causation. What he is against is thinking that we have some deep understanding about how one thing causes another. He says we don't. All we see is one thing happening, the cause, and then we see the effect happening, and we see they happen together, and that's all we really can mean by causation. There's nothing deep about it. So here's his one definition of causation. We may define a cause to be an object followed by another, where all objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So you can think of about that with like hitting pool balls. You get the same effect every time. Turning on lights, you get the same effect every time. So they're meant to be kind of reliable connections. He talks about it in a little more closely with these three criteria. So he thinks cause and effect have to be contiguous in space and time. That is, the cause and the effect have to be basically in the same space when it's happening, and they also have to be at the same point of time when it's happening. The cause happens just before the effect. And so that's the physical contiguity and the temporal contiguity. And then there's the constant conjunction that it always happens. It has to be a repeatable connection. So that's what we really mean by causal judgments. Nothing deep at all. It's just like these things are connected in our experience. So what he's arguing against are people who say that we can see the necessary connection between cause and effect. So they say like there's a sort of either some kind of logical or physical necessity that the cause makes the effect happen in some profound way, and that understanding that connection, we understand the kind of the nature of the universe, we understand things in the world, we understand the ultimate nature of things. And Hume's reply to all of that is like, well, you just don't see anything like that. You don't see anything like some ultimate connection. You don't see any necessity. All you see is one thing happening and then the next happening. So he says, it is true that once you get used to seeing the cause happen, you turn the light on, you turn the light switch on, and you expect the light to go on. So you have a feeling in your head that the effect is going to happen. And that, he says, well, that's probably where you get the idea that the effect has to happen. It's just this sort of expectation. But that doesn't mean, having this feeling doesn't mean it has to happen. It just means you have this expectation. That's all there is to it. So he's totally rejecting any kind of necessary connection between cause and effect. He's just saying it's like you see these things happening all the time and you get used to it, and it's fine to be used to it. But what you don't see is any sort of deep causal powers. People like Descartes thought that we could understand geometry, and somehow, because we understand geometry, that would mean, because the geometry is the essence of matter, then we would understand the essence of how things interact. Hume was thinking, well, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Now, there was the pressing issue, which we've talked about before, about how to think about gravity. Because as Newton had said, if you have two objects, then one has a gravitational force on the other. They both have a gravitational force on each other. And when it comes to big objects like the sun and the earth, that's a very significant gravitational force. And then the question is, well, how does that force happen? Because we can't see any sort of physical objects, any sort of chain between the earth and the sun. How does the sun manage to pull the earth around in an orbit around it? And Hume was saying, Hume's basic position was, we have no idea. Certainly we have no, since the cause and the effect are separated from each other, there's no reason to think that that's regular causation. So we should just hold off on any sort of explanation at all. All we know is that we see this happening, but it's not something that we can explain. So in some ways, he certainly is happy to go along with Newton's laws as devices of prediction. He thinks Newton's laws are very useful, and you can make all sorts of good predictions with them, but you shouldn't take them seriously in revealing some deep essence of the world. Really, what you've got is like an instrument to make predictions. So anything going beyond our experience about what's really going on, that's just speculation. And he says we shouldn't engage in speculation. Now, Newton also said we shouldn't engage in speculation. So in some ways, it seems like they agree. What Hume is really disagreeing with is other people thinking that they can find the deep nature of matter in Newton's laws. So Newton has his gravitational theory, and it's mathematically modeled in a very clear way. So Newton himself didn't specify how it worked, but it was just a question: how is action at a distance possible? And we've seen Hume's criteria for what counts as causes, and action at a distance just doesn't count as a cause because the two things aren't in the same space. So he's pretty kind of skeptical about concepts of gravity. Leibniz had this requirement for science that scientific explanation must demonstrate how the observed qualities or effects arise from the intrinsic nature or essence of the subject as explicable modifications. We could just see how the effect comes from the cause. So it should be just transparent to us. And Hume was like, well, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. All we see is the cause, the effect. Apart from that, it's just mysterious. So, yeah. So he's definitely skeptical about action at a distance. So moving on from the nature of matter, the other big mystery, well, one of the other big mysteries for these philosophers was the relationship between mind and body. We've seen Descartes talk about it with his dualism. We've seen Hobbes's materialism, and we've seen Locke be pretty agnostic about how consciousness happens. So there's Cartesian dualism, which says that mind and body are distinct substances, and the mind is a different non-material substance from the body. So Hobbes, with his materialism, thinking that the mind is just the same thing as the brain, matter and motion. And Hume, pretty similar to Locke, is skeptical of both dualism and materialism. He says, like, well, we just have no idea how the mind happens. But he goes a bit further than Locke, because he says we have no idea of even us having an enduring self. Certainly, if you look into yourself, you don't have any experience of some kind of soul, some kind of substance. All you experience is your own particular impressions and ideas. That's all you have to go on. So he says, all we can possibly mean about ourselves is just a bundle. We're just a bundle of stuff and nothing more than that. So he's totally skeptical about dualism. He's totally skeptical about materialism. He doesn't think that we have any idea how the mind happens, either immaterial or material. So he's totally agnostic about the nature of mind. So it's helpful just to kind of think about the relationship between Hume and Descartes, because they seem to kind of disagree about so much. It makes a good contrast. So Descartes was this big rationalist. He thought that we could have pure reason, we could have absolute certainty about the nature of the self as an immaterial substance, we could have absolute certainty about the nature of God, and we could have absolute certainty about science and the external world. So he was very confident that you could prove everything. Hume was like, no, you can't prove any of that. All you know is your own experience, and that's all there is to it. So he's just against everything. Descartes was all about, I think, therefore I am. So he seemed to think you could know your soul in some ways, the res cogitans. Hume says, no, that's not part of your experience. You don't have any experience of a self. All you have is an experience of individual perceptions. You can feel like your body. You can like focus on the ideas in your head. You can have feelings of your emotions, but nothing like a self. So his view is like a bundle theory. He says the mind is not a substance in which perceptions inhere. We have no idea of substance of any kind. In some ways, he thinks the whole idea of substance is actually a nonsense because it's not even related to an impression we have. So we have no idea of what is derived from some impression. We have no impression of any substance, either material or spiritual. We know nothing but particular qualities and perceptions. So he just doesn't really even believe in substance at all. He doesn't really believe in anything or any primary qualities. We have the impressions of color and shape and stuff like that, but no impression of any substance. So he thinks like the idea of mental substance is basically a meaningless fiction. He writes, Descartes maintained that thought was the essence of the mind, not this thought or that thought, but thought in general, like an abstraction. This seems to be absolutely unintelligible, since everything that exists is particular, and therefore it must be our several particular perceptions that compose the mind. I say compose the mind, not belong to it. So he thinks not only that Descartes was wrong, but in fact his ideas literally were meaningless. So just to kind of recap this theory of the self, it's a bundle theory. He's going against the idea that we have some kind of substantial, enduring self. And it was a very influential view. So he doesn't think there's any sort of substantial self. He thinks the idea of our continuing to exist over a period of time. The idea of memory is very important, but that doesn't give us any direct idea about a fixed self. It just enables us to kind of tell a story about how our lives are going and continuing. Uh, so at least in some ways, he thinks the whole idea of self is like an illusion. And it's produced by psychological processes, but there isn't actually such a thing as a self. He says, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. So he thinks that since we don't have any experience of a self, then the whole idea is meaningless. Now, Hume had a theory of free will, which is in some ways one of his most popular views. He wasn't the first person to hold a compatibilist view, but he defended it pretty well. So he's not necessarily tied to the idea that there's any kind of metaphysical determinism, but he certainly thinks like that the world seems pretty predictable, and he thinks that humans can be predictable. He believed in the kind of science of human nature. So he said, well, what is it? Does it mean that that if we are predictable, does that mean we're not free? And he says, no. All it means to be free is to be able to act on your desires and motives. And that can allow us to talk about moral responsibility without denying causation. So he thinks that free will and determinism are compatible. And so his view is known as a compatibilist view. Now, the determinist holds the opposite idea. The determinist says everything is determined. And if it's not actually possible for you to choose other than you do, then you're not free. So imagine you're going down to have lunch and you have a choice between taco and pizza. Because of whatever factors there are, your likes, what's available, it is entirely predictable that you are going to choose the tacos. And in fact, so given if you accept the pattern of events as sort of that's what's going to happen, then there's no chance that you're going to choose the pizza. Then the determinist, who's incompatibilist, says, well, then you're not really free because you couldn't actually choose the pizza. You're caused to choose the tacos instead. So they say, if determinism is true, then you don't have free will. Hume kind of says to that, and then you're just confused. So he makes a distinction between two kinds of liberty. And basically, it's the kind of liberty which you want and the kind of liberty which doesn't make any sense. So the kind of liberty which doesn't make any sense is like the one that you have your kind of desires, and that says, well, you could choose a different option despite what your desires are. And Hume says, well, that just doesn't make any sense. What the kind of liberty that you want is just being able to do what you want. Now, obviously, if you're there in having lunch and somebody kind of comes to you and says, if you don't choose the pizza, I'm going to break your arm. Well, that would be kind of taking away your freedom. Or if somebody puts you on the floor and hog ties you, then you have your freedom taken away. Then you can't do what you want to do, which is, you wanted to have the tacos. So he says that's all there is to liberty. So he says, we may define a perfect human liberty to consist in the power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Right. So if you have liberty of spontaneity, then obviously you're free from external constraints, people forcing you to do stuff. And then your choices are determined by your preferences and your personal history. So that's perfectly natural, that what you want is determined by your own character and your past experiences. And he says, well, that's perfectly fine for moral responsibility. We can hold people morally responsible for what they do if, in some straightforward way, their actions come from who they are. This ties into a sort of more general view. He sort of agrees with virtue ethics, that what's important is what kind of character you have. So he, in a slightly puzzling part, he says, if what you do is totally out of character, then you're not responsible for it. So if somehow what you do doesn't come from you, but rather it's just kind of it's just random, then you're not morally responsible for it. So he says, actions are by their very nature temporary and perishing, and where they proceed not for some cause and the characters and disposition of the person who performed them, they infix themselves not themselves upon him, and can neither redound to his honor if good, or nor infamy if evil. The action itself may be blamable, but the person is not responsible for it. And as it proceeded from nothing in him that is durable or constant, and leaves nothing of that nature behind it, it is impossible he can, upon its account, become the object of punishment or vengeance. I'm not sure if that fits in with how the law operates. If suddenly you become homicidal for no reason, and you kill somebody, even though it's totally not in your character, I mean, the law might say it's temporary insanity or something, but generally you're probably going to be punished for it. So that's his account of free will. Now we move on to Hume's theory of induction. Induction is a sort of technical term, and the idea is like, how do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Well, generally we say the sun has always risen, so the future is always like the past, therefore we know the sun is going to rise tomorrow. And Hume says, hold on, that's wrong. So induction is like making generalizations about the future from past experiences. So if all the swans we've seen are white, we can conclude that all swans are white, and we can then predict that the next swan we see will also be white. And Hume says that is not justified. So his argument is pretty straightforward. He says that there are two sorts of reasoning. There's sort of math and logic reasoning, and you can't logically prove that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Then the other sorts of reasoning is probable. You base it on experience, so it's not logically necessary, and so generally, people sort of assume that seeing past patterns gives you strong reason to know that the future is going to be like the past. But he says, well, that's a circular argument. So you're trying to reason about tomorrow, and you're saying that past instances of induction have been successful, but then you have to assume the future is going to be like the past. But that's exactly what you are trying to prove. So it's a circular argument. It's basically saying you haven't experienced the future, so you have no knowledge of the future. You have no knowledge of the future, then you can't with any sort of certainty make claims about it. So you think saying it's just a matter of custom and habit. We observe lots of patterns like the sun rising, and you have a habit of expecting similar patterns in the future. That's a psychological fact about humans. That doesn't make it logically necessary. So what does he think we should do? I mean, you might sort of think, well, if you don't know what the future is going to be like, you just want to you could just curl up in the ball and never get out of bed. But that's not what Hume is saying. He's saying you should just go along with your regular habits. You just live your life as normal, but you stop thinking you have a justification for these claims about the future. You just kind of say, well, in some ways, it's probably is to saying you just hope for the best. Hope nothing changes. So he says all inferences from experience, therefore, are effects of custom, not of reasoning. All right, so his view about induction seems somewhat surprising, and people are still arguing about that. It's sort of less surprising to us these days that he would argue that God either does not exist or we have no reason to believe in God. So he will look at his criticisms of the cosmological argument and the teleological argument. We won't look at his criticism of St. Anselm's ontological argument. We could have looked at some of that stuff already when it came to Descartes. But pretty obviously, he's going to say none of these arguments work. And the most obvious sort of reason is that we have not got any experience of God. If you don't have any experience of God, it doesn't make any sense to claim that you know God. And maybe he might even go further than that. He might say, if you don't have any experience of God, you don't even know what the word God means. You're just like using the word in it's basically a nonsense word. So he definitely thinks that belief in God is kind of based on kind of various non-rational factors, psychological factors. People are brought up to believe in God, so they just continue to believe in God. Or sometimes there are emotional factors, and so he thinks that the whole idea that we can understand something deeply mysterious like God is very unlikely. And this quotation from him kind of he sounds a little judgy, right? He says the vulgar are naturally inclined to extend their curiosity to a great length, and in proportion as they are ignorant and barbarous, their curiosity will be the more extensive and inquisitive. They will not content themselves with a visible course of nature, but will penetrate, if possible, to the invisible world and raise theories of celestial beings who direct all the operations of nature and superintend the affairs of men. You think people make stuff up. So he definitely thinks that is kind of silly. So let's look at the first cause argument. It's a very kind of familiar argument. Basically, the idea is that everything has a cause, therefore the universe has a cause, and whatever the cause is must itself be uncaused and capable of creating the universe, so that uncaused cause is God. Hume kind of demolishes this pretty quickly. For one thing, he says is like, well, if there is an uncaused cause, why does that have to be God? Why couldn't the universe cause itself? Uh, why do you have to conclude there's a God? And then he says, why should you assume that everything has a cause? Why couldn't the universe just be a random thing happening? Sometimes things happen without a cause. So maybe that's what happens with the universe. We don't have any knowledge of that. We certainly didn't experience the creation of the universe, so it's something we have no knowledge about. So we shouldn't speculate about that. Then there's the argument from design, which he really goes to town on. And he thinks certainly it's the argument is an interesting argument. So you can observe complex things in nature. Take the human eye. The human eye is extremely complex, and it seems like it's very kind of carefully designed. So, and note that he is writing long before the theory of evolution. But so he says, well, people are naturally inclined to say something like the eye looks like it's designed. We're used to design things. Design things have creators. Therefore, the eye and everything human has a creator. Therefore, we can conclude there is an intelligent designer of the universe. So it's in some ways it's like an argument from analogy. We're used to like watchmakers making watches, and we say, well, there's an analogy between God making the universe. So one thing he says is these sorts of arguments, like analogies, they don't give you proof. Rather, what they give you is a probability. So the best you can hope for from this argument is it kind of it makes it more likely that the universe has a creator, a designer. And there's no particular reason from this argument to think the designer is a good creator, a morally good one. Certainly not infinite in wisdom and goodness. In fact, the world isn't perfect. So why should we think the creator is perfect? Then he says, it could easily be that there are wicked creators. So maybe it's possible that the creator of the universe is not immortal and all good. Rather, the creator of the universe may be mortal and also may not be good. Then he has this idea that what we know about creating stuff is that you start out with a prototype, and the first prototype doesn't work, and then you ditch that, and you go to your second prototype and make a improvement. And clearly, like people didn't make watches, they weren't able to make a watch the first time they tried. It took many attempts. So if you can say, well, there's an analogy between human creation and God making the universe, then you have to say, well, the God had to make many attempts too, and so he kind of had lots of prototypes. They didn't work out, and so he ditched those, and now we've got this world. Seems like, well, is that what you want to argue from a religious point of view? It seems not to fit with religion very well. And then the most fundamental point is that we don't have any experience of the creation of the world. It's only when two species of objects are found to be constantly conjoined that we can infer the one from the other. And were an effect presented which was entirely singular and could not be comprehended by any known species, I do not see that we could form any conjecture or inference at all concerning its cause. So we've no experience of the world being caused, so we shouldn't make any conclusions about that. So he thinks that the whole idea of trying to prove that there's an intelligent designer of the world just doesn't make any sense at all. Now, there is a kind of question about whether religion is a bad thing. Now, remember, it was due to the clerics of his time that Hume wasn't able to get the jobs he wanted. So he probably was not big admirers of them because they made his life more difficult. I mean, it worked out in the end. He wrote the history of England, and that enabled him to make a bunch of money, and he did fine. But he always kind of wanted a university job, and because of his religious belief, the clerics made it difficult. And you can certainly look at the history of humans, and you can look at all the bad things that religion has done. But he does also want to say that religion can have beneficial effects. In religious belief and believing in an afterlife and a promised reward in the afterlife may get people to behave better. And if you said, oh, there's no afterlife, then people might be more inclined to just be totally selfish and do whatever it takes to make their lives better now. So he thought, there could be a good side to religion. Although I guess his basic idea is if people are influenced by religious belief, maybe they're not that smart. Lastly, let's look in his terms of his theory of morality. So most philosophers prior to Hume thought that morality was like absolute. Plato thought that the idea of justice was one of the forms. It was like a total universal and could be understood by the mind. And you had religious philosophers arguing that the universe has a sort of inner harmony to it, and there are natural laws, and we should behave according to these natural laws. Not surprisingly, Hume thinks, oh, that's just nonsense. None of that makes any sense. He thinks you can give a much more simple explanation of our moral beliefs. We just have natural reactions to things going on around us, and that's what morality is based on. It's not based on anything like proof, like mathematics. So he says, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend any other office than to serve and obey them. So basically, humans are commanded by our feelings, and that's how it should be. Now, in some ways, he has a pretty optimistic view of human nature. He thinks we have natural sympathy with other people. If you see somebody suffering, then you have a natural inclination to help them. If you see somebody behaving well, you naturally admire them. If you see somebody hurting other people, you naturally condemn the other person. So he thinks humans just have this nature. Obviously, sometimes there are people who don't go along with that, who behave badly, and that may be because of whatever experiences they've had in the past. Maybe they've been messed up by their previous experience. But his basic point is most humans have sort of pretty much the same emotional reactions to good things and bad things happening in the world. So that's the basis of morality, these feelings we have, these natural sentiments. And the role of reason is just to help us to do what we are inclined to do. As we've seen, he thinks that character is the most important part of morality. What kind of person you are, the kind of steady traits you have in terms of like whether you're benevolent, whether you have a sense of justice, whether you're courageous. Those things are very valuable. We all tend to approve of those things. He also thinks that we tend to approve of actions which have social utility, which are good for society. And we tend to disapprove of actions which are bad for society. It's not like we have some sort of mathematical proof of why that should be. It's just that that's how we are. So he doesn't think you can prove morality in any absolute way, but he thinks that just the mere fact that we have this nature is enough to kind of understand morality. And he writes quite a lot about like how we judge it. So in his inquiry concerning human understanding at the end, he has this famous quotation, which seems very anti-philosophical. He says, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity, anything by the church, or any school metaphysics, that would be especially things like Aquinas, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? It's like, is it math? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? Is it based on experience? No. Then commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. So basically he's saying, burn all the philosophy books. So if you are impressed by Hume, then there's a question, well, what would it be like to live according to Hume's ideas? Well, obviously, he can say, well, base your life on experience. Try and be sensible. Don't believe what people tell you if it's dogmatic or is not based on experience. So certainly be highly skeptical of people who say they have all the answers, and seek evidence to support claims. In terms of morality, he thinks it's very good to be empathetic, and you should develop your empathy. You should be compassionate for others. You should understand other people's feelings and perspectives. And you should be virtuous. Right? It's good to practice honesty, justice, benevolence. Probably good to live in the present and don't dwell on the past. Find joys in simple pleasures. Probably quite Epicurean in that way. Don't think that reason is going to give you all the answers. And so I think I don't think he put it in this way, but it made the idea of trusting your intuition, trusting your customs and habits. Says, well, that our custom and habit is probably the best guide we have, not reason, just how we tend to do things. And definitely you kind of seek social harmony, promote cooperation, and avoid being some kind of extremist. He's not saying he has an extreme or definite moral code, but he is going to give a sort of framework to how to live. So his view seems in some ways pretty straightforward. So it's interesting to think about how Hume compares to other philosophers. In his time, he wasn't necessarily as influential. Descartes was a big scientist, mathematician. He did a lot, and he talked about scientific method. Even though his arguments weren't particularly impressive when it came to the mind and body or God, they still were highly influential. People paid a lot of attention to them. Locke was especially influential with his political theories, separation of powers, that kind of stuff, and freedom of religion. And his work was highly influential on the American Revolution, but also his work in terms of understanding the nature of matter was taken very seriously. Locke um, he dealt with a lot of philosophy. He wasn't a scientist. He basically did history, apart from philosophy. Uh, his views were his philosophical views were highly provocative, and they ended up being extremely influential, although at the time, probably not that many people took him very seriously. This is a question of like, well, what do we want to say about Hume? Uh, now looking back, do his arguments make any sense? And his ideas about not knowing that the external world exists, that seems sort of surprising, right? Because uh, believing in the external world seems to actually to make the best sense of our experience. For one thing, we all seem to see the same things. It's not like we're all just trapped in our own personal experience. We interact with each other and we all have experiences of similar objects. So the fact that we all see the same objects seems to indicate the objects are really there. And then we have physics and chemistry. They seem to be highly successful theories. So it makes a lot of sense to say, well, the reason they're highly successful is they're true. There is actually stuff out there which physics and chemistry are describing. So it seems like a Lockean view about understanding the true nature of matter in some ways with the primary qualities and then being careful about the secondary qualities, that's a more plausible view than Hume's skepticism. There is a kind of, that this does raise the question, which obviously Hume wouldn't have put it in terms of the matrix, but now we can worry, do we all live in a virtual reality? And Hume would be aware of Descartes' worry that we're always being deceived by an evil demon, which is a sort of similar sort of skeptical worry. So yeah, can we prove that that's not true? Well, we can't prove it with any absolute certainty, but it does seem we don't have any reason to think we are in a virtual reality. So there's no particular reason to take it seriously. So Hume says we should just stick to our experience and not make any metaphysical claims. But that seems it seems like we're reasonably justified in not believing we're in a virtual reality. And when we get to talk about Kant, we're going to see that Kant takes Hume's views about the external world very seriously. And Kant actually basically agrees with Hume that we can't have knowledge of things in themselves, of ultimate reality. But Kant says we can have objective knowledge of our experiences and including the laws of nature. So we'll see how Kant reacts to Hume pretty soon. Hume says we're just a bundle, and that definitely goes against kind of a lot of religious views. In some ways, Hume's bundle view seems very close to Buddhist no-self views. They seem to also say we're just a bundle of perceptions. Now, it's sort of interesting, the Buddhists said, well, you should really reflect on this and maybe become a Buddhist monk and retreat from society and just meditate most of the time. That's definitely not Hume's reaction. Hume's reaction is more like, just continue on as usual. It's not a big deal. There's no reason to think that the fact that we don't know anything about a soul, there's no reason to make that interrupt our regular lives. But maybe you shouldn't be planning on an afterlife because there's no reason to think there's an afterlife. Seems like Hume's view is kind of like the idea that our self is more like a story we construct rather than the reality. But that's okay, so long as it works for you, then that's fine. He doesn't think there's any sort of need to have a kind of crisis about it, to be worried about it. The theory, his work on induction is particularly has been very much debated, whether he's really proven that we have no knowledge of the future. There's been a lot of philosophical work on that, and a lot of actually different interpretations of what Hume was really saying about that. But it's complicated. Hume just assumes, as you would, that there's a kind of, you can easily distinguish the future from the past. That's made more complicated when you get to Einstein's theory of general relativity, a theory where space and time are in some ways interchangeable. And so it seems that it becomes more complicated demarcating what actually counts as the future. So you'd at least have to kind of make his theory more complicated in order to take account of Einstein's views. His views about free will have been highly popular. These days, his compatibilist view is probably the most commonly accepted view today by philosophers. His views of causation as constant conjunction, a bit crude, but other philosophers influenced by Hume have built on his approach and taken his basic idea, we don't have any idea of necessary powers. And his view of morality is controversial, but some people defend that. So in some ways, his philosophical views are still highly influential today.